Okay, so that brings us to week 5, which will be chapter 5. So chapter 5 is Terror from Below, Dissident Terrorism. And so this will be a shorter lecture because in subsequent chapters, we're going to talk more about specific groups, and most of the groups that we talk about are considered terrorists from below, or dissidents, different types of dissidents. So this week, because it's an exam week, we'll have a shortened lecture. So Martin calls the terrorist paradigm that includes dissidents. He has 3 different types: revolutionary dissident terrorism, nihilist dissident terrorism, and nationalist dissident terrorism. So the dissident paradigm for terrorists from below are committed by non-state groups or movements that resist government. They're resisting the government that's in power, or a dominant racial, ethnic, or religious group. In the book, he gives examples of the Zapatista, National Liberation. Excuse me, I'm not great at pronouncing Spanish names. I apologize. And so he gives several examples, which you can look at and read about in the text. Again, folks, I can't emphasize enough the importance of reading the text. So you have to read the text because I cannot cover all the material that Martin includes, specifically the groups that he includes. I can't cover it all because obviously the lectures would be too long, and I fear some folks are falling asleep to my voice as it is. I'm probably putting many people to sleep. They probably might even be playing this for their children to go to sleep. But at any rate, the first group he talks about are revolutionary dissident terrorists. And revolutionaries, they seek to change the political system that they live under. They see it as unjust, corrupt, and so they form a revolution to overthrow the government. Oftentimes, revolutionaries will start off and use terrorist tactics in order to gain influence and in order to gain followers and show that they're willing to kill and die for their cause. And again, their goal is to destroy an existing order and to build a new or well-designed new society. In the last half of the century, most of the dissident terrorist groups were looking to overthrow the regime that was in power and install a socialist or even a communist regime. Nihilist terrorists, nihilist dissident terrorists, they're an interesting group because they want to reject all religious and moral principles, often in the belief that life is meaningless. So we're going to overthrow the government. The problem with nihilists really gaining traction is because they don't really have an answer to what they're going to install, what kind of government they're going to install in the wake of their revolution. So nihilism became popular in the 19th century. It had its roots in Russia. It's closely associated with anarchism. So anarchism is similar. They're similar, and the word anarchism it derives from the word anarchy. So if we overthrow the government, obviously anarchy would rule. So that's where, hence the anarchism came from. So nihilists and anarchists are very, very similar. Again, modern nihilists seek the destruction of the existing order, but without a clear idea of what will replace it. Their goal is to destroy that order, and victory is the destruction of the old society. In the book, he uses the Al Qaeda network as a nihilist group seeking to destroy the world order. The problem with using them as a nihilist or an anarchist group is that Al Qaeda, they pretty much have a clear vision of what kind of government or what kind of what they want to install, the type of rule that they want to install, and it's pretty much sectarian. So I'm not sure if I would group them into that in there, but Martin does. So again, you can read about that in the text. So nationalist dissident terrorism, Martin calls that's it's the aspirations of a people. Oftentimes, the group will start off using terrorism. He uses the Provisional Irish Republican Army as an example. They want to overthrow the current government and instill a government based on possibly it might even be a majority of the folks that live in the country. In Ireland, the majority of the folks are Irish Catholic, and they were being ruled by the British, which were mostly Protestant. So they call it the aspirations or the will of a people. So nationalist movements, they look to defend their culture, their religious beliefs, or their heritage. In the book, again, he uses Vietnam. He also talks about Kashmir in, as one of the examples. So their goal is to mobilize a particular demographic group against another group or movement. Again, it could be a minority movement or it could be a majority movement. Oftentimes, majorities are ruled by a minority of the people. In Iraq, the most of the folks that lived in Iraq were um, Shia, and they were ruled by a Sunni. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni Muslim, and but most of the folks that lived there were Shia. So the will of the people, when they got rid of Saddam Hussein, the Shia movement has been part of the insurgency. That's what has been causing some of it. I mean, it's a little that's a little bit. That's really not that's a general explanation. It's more complicated than that. But that's one example where a minority is ruling a majority of the people. Again, we come to the question: are revolutionaries, nihilists, and nationalists, are they freedom fighters? So, no matter the cause, dissident terrorists perceive themselves as members of an enlightened fighting elite. And so, again, we said that terrorists, the difference between terrorists and a guerrilla revolutionary, are terrorists attack or they target innocent people, whereas guerrillas oftentimes will target members of the military. So, when we talk about whether they're freedom fighters, again, it's a matter of perception, which side of the fighting group you're on, and the perception created. Sometimes the perception is created by the media. Um, Martin also talks about communal terrorism, and communal are different types of groups within a country. And so he talks about ethno-nationalist communal terrorism, religious terrorism, and ideological communal terrorism. So ethno-nationalist communal terrorism is the fostering of a distinct group that has distinct cultural practices in their religion or in their history. And so terrorism might become a tool if they feel threatened or their identity, or they feel that their identity is being threatened by the government or other groups within the country. Ethno-national conflicts are found everywhere, but the highest concentration of this type of terrorism is found in Africa. In the previous slide, the last part of the slide said see below for examples, and I eliminated this slide with the examples. So to see examples of ethno-national terrorism, you turn to page 121 in the book, and he uses Nigeria and Corsica as several examples. So you can read about those on that page. The next type of communal terrorism is religious. And so sectarian, which means religious. Sectarian is a fancy word for saying that a country has sectarian violence. It's religious. And so it would be violence among different religious groups. I'm not going to get into too much because I believe the next chapter or the chapter after that is about religious violence. So we'll talk about it at length in those chapters. Again, here he gives up the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which in the one of the previous lectures that's in the folder lectures, there's a slide in the slideshow. There is a whole um, description of what occurred in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Okay, so some have argued that religious communal terrorism is the oldest form of terror and terrorism, and has been occurring since man started to practice religion. But in the book, again, he uses the Irish Republican Army and the in the Sudan, the Mid East. The Mid East is a hotbed of religious terrorism. So again, like I said in the previous slide, we'll talk about religious terrorism, excuse me, at length in one of the subsequent chapters. So, ideological communal terrorism and violence became more pervasive and popular in post World War II after the United States and the Soviet Union began what's been called the Cold War. So there was a global um, war between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union, with different countries around the world taking sides, and other countries looking to overthrow their government and instill or install either a communist or a capitalist regime, depending on what was occupying the country at that time. On page 124, Martin gives three examples, and they're quick, you should read them. One is on Greece, the other is Angola, and the other one is on Indonesia. And they're examples of the ideological terrorism that took place and the amount of lives that were lost during these terrorist conflicts. So Martin goes on to describe the new dissident terrorist morality, and Martin argues that there's a new form of terrorism that has taken place in the last 25 or 30 years, in which there are fewer moral scruples than in previous generations, in which the new terrorism, any target is legitimate, whereas in previous generations, terrorist attacks were more they were more surgical. In the case of the Irish Republican Army, they often would call in and warn the government that there was a bomb and give them a chance to um, evacuate people from the area where the bomb was planted. So the new terrorism has accepted that innocent people are going to die, and so he argues that there's less or fewer moral scruples in today's more modern, or what he terms the new terrorism. And Martin argues that the new terrorists have a broader definition of enemy groups, who the enemy is. So for Al Qaeda, the enemy was the West, it was the United States, and anybody that was affiliated with the United States is Al Qaeda's enemy, which included the Saudis because they allowed the United States to use Saudi soil during the Gulf War. And so, what's become a big worry um, amongst um, government officials that are fighting terrorism or in a war on terrorism is that they might be the unrestricted use of weapon technologies, dirty bombs, uh, any kind of radiological weapon, um, any kind of weapon that was unconventional, including any kind of what we call weapons of mass destruction. So the new terrorists have been, they believe, were looking to use these kind of weapons. Ultimately, in the last few years, most of the weaponry that they've used hasn't been weapons of mass destruction. It's been traditional bombs and bomb making materials that have been used even by the new terrorists, and they've been quite successful with them. So the new dissidents and the new terrorism have what we've termed terrorist cells and lone wolves. So older terrorist groups used vertical hierarchies and were more organized and included many more people in their organizations. Today, the lone wolf might just be someone who has been influenced and radicalized by the internet that really doesn't have any communication with any other group. These are the lone wolves. The terrorist cells, they might be smaller cells that are only in contact with each other, and thus they're harder to weed out. They might only be in contact with one other person who is in contact with the broader leaders of the group. So these new terrorist cells and these new lone wolves have posed a more of a challenge to law enforcement to try to locate them. If somebody is sitting home on a computer becoming radicalized, unless they're able to track what that person is viewing uh, and what kind of material that they're downloading from the internet, it's virtually impossible to find that person. So the lone wolf could be that individual that doesn't have a formal association with any group, but acts out his agenda, which is consistent with the group's beliefs. So cells are indistinct command and organizational figurations, and lone wolves are the single individuals. So that's going to do it for this week. I'm sorry that I rushed through it, and I did because, like I said, subsequent chapters we're going to talk about Terror from Below in more detail. So good luck with the quiz, and I will see you next week. Take care.